When my son looked me in the eyes and said, "You chose your career over me," the air in the cafe froze. I opened my mouth to explain, but all that came out was a quiet, "I'm sorry." Seconds later, my phone lit up. James had blocked me. For 20 years, I believed every late night at the office, every missed birthday, every project that pulled me thousands of miles away was for him. I thought a stable future, a paid college, a debt-free life would speak louder than my absence. I didn't realize the silence was all he remembered. The truth? I wasn't ready for the words he said that day, and I wasn't ready for what came after. Because that moment wasn't the end. It was just the door slamming in my face before a path I never knew existed opened. There were truths I had hidden, sacrifices no one knew about, and a final chance that came when I least expected it. Before we dive into the story, the years of distance, the heartbreak, and the one moment that made me realize love can't wait, stay until the end. Because you might think you know where this is going, but trust me, the ending will make you question everything you thought about second chances. My name is Michael Harris. I'm 55 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been a software engineer. For years, people around me admired my work ethic, my discipline, and my relentless drive to succeed. In the early days of my career, I was the guy who stayed until the lights went out in the office, the one who never missed a deadline. My colleagues called me a machine. I thought they were complimenting me. But back then, I wasn't just working for myself. I was a husband, a father, a man who wanted to build something more than just code or software. I wanted to build a future. When my son James was born, I swore I would give him everything I never had growing up. I came from a blue-collar family, where my dad worked 2 jobs and my mom stretched every dollar like it was elastic. I wanted James to grow up without feeling that kind of constant financial pressure. I remember the first time I held him. He was barely a day old, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, looking like the smallest and most fragile thing in the world. His tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, and I made a promise to him in that moment. I will never let you down. I didn't know then that promises could be broken without bad intentions. Things between my wife, Karen, and me began to shift when James was around 5. My hours were long, and Karen's patience was short. She came from a family that valued presence over paychecks, and every late night I spent at the office added a stone to the wall growing between us. We fought quietly at first, subtle digs at dinner, cool silences in the bedroom. But the arguments escalated. By the time James turned 7, the marriage had collapsed. Officially, the divorce papers listed irreconcilable differences. But the real story was more complicated. Karen's parents never liked me. They thought I was too absorbed in my work, too focused on ambition instead of family traditions. They saw my career as a threat to the way they believed a husband and father should live. When the divorce came, their influence shaped everything. I didn't just lose my wife. I lost my place in James's daily life. The custody agreement gave Karen primary custody, and I was granted alternate weekends. I told myself it was temporary, that James would understand when he got older, that he'd see I was still there for him, just in a different way. So, I made a decision. If I couldn't be there every day, I would make sure my absence counted for something. I took on more projects, stayed longer hours, accepted promotions that meant travel. Every paycheck, Every bonus, every stock option went toward James's future. I set up a college fund that would be untouchable, bought life insurance, and made sure every possible expense was covered. I told myself I was protecting him. I believed, naively, that children measure love in security. That one day James would look at the life he had, the doors that were open to him, and see the sacrifices I made. I pictured him as a young man thanking me for what I'd done. It was a comforting fantasy. What I didn't see was how my choices looked from his side. From James's perspective, I wasn't at school plays or soccer games. I wasn't there to help him with homework, to talk him through his first heartbreak, or to sit at the table and ask about his day. I wasn't there when he needed me, at least, not in the way he needed. There's something else I've never told anyone. The divorce wasn't just about my hours at work. There was a night, one fight, that changed everything. Karen had come home from her parents' house, angrier than I'd ever seen her. She accused me of caring more about my latest project than about being at their family gathering. Her father had made some pointed comments about men who hide in offices instead of being men at home. That night, she gave me an ultimatum. It wasn't about quitting my job. It was about fitting into a mold I knew I couldn't live in. When the lawyers got involved, I fought for more time with James. I even considered stepping back from a major contract, a move that could have cost me millions, in exchange for a more favorable custody arrangement. But Karen's parents had connections, and the court sided with her. That's the part James never knew, the part I never told him. I wanted to protect him from the bitterness of those details. After the divorce, I moved into a smaller apartment across town. Every other weekend, I'd pick James up and try to cram 2 weeks of fatherhood into 48 hours. We'd go to the park, play video games, sometimes just sit quietly in the living room. He was polite, sweet, and I convinced myself that meant he was okay. But looking back now, I realize I was a guest in my own son's life. The years passed quickly. I threw myself deeper into work, telling myself it was for James. I watched his life through secondhand updates, photos sent by Karen, holiday cards signed in her handwriting. I told myself he would understand, that when he was grown, he'd see my choices as love. I didn't realize that every absence was a wound, and every missed moment was a scar that no amount of money could cover. The first few months after the divorce felt like a strange balancing act. I tried to keep my weekends with James full of energy, making them something he would look forward to. I'd pick him up on Friday evenings with a smile plastered across my face, determined to make every moment count. We'd go for pizza at the little place he liked, or I'd take him to the park, pushing him on the swings until his laughter filled the air. But the gaps in between those weekends began to feel wider, and my absence during the week became more obvious. The first event I missed was his school's fall recital. I was in Seattle, leading a critical product demo that had been scheduled months in advance. I told myself I'd make it up to him the next weekend. But when I saw the photo Karen sent, James in a crisp white shirt, standing with his classmates, I noticed his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Then came his 8th birthday. I'd planned to fly back early from a conference in Austin, but the meeting ran over. I called him from the airport, promising we'd celebrate when he came over. He said it was fine, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. The following weekend, I brought him a brand new game console, thinking it would erase the sting of my absence. He played it, smiled, But something about that smile told me it wasn't the gift he wanted. It became a pattern I didn't fully recognize at the time. Missed school plays, missed soccer games. I kept a drawer full of ticket stubs to events I'd planned to attend, but never made it to. At first, James would call me after these events, eager to tell me about how he'd played or what he'd performed. Over time, those calls got shorter. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Our weekends together began to change. The first few hours would be warm. He'd tell me about school, his friends, but by Sunday afternoon, he'd grow quiet. I assumed he was just tired, but in hindsight, I think he was bracing himself for the moment I'd drive him back to his mother's house. I tried to compensate in the only way I knew. I made sure he never wanted for anything material. New sneakers, before the old ones wore out. The latest gadgets, the trendiest jackets. I thought these were signs of love. I didn't understand that what he wanted was time. One of the hardest moments for me came during his 10th birthday. I had cleared my schedule entirely, determined not to miss it. I picked him up early, took him to his favorite burger place, then to a movie he'd been excited about. Everything was going perfectly until he looked at me across the table and said, "Thanks, Dad. It's nice when you can make it." That word, when, stuck with me. Not because you always make it, not even because you made it this time, just when. It was casual, almost offhand, but it felt like a quiet acknowledgement that he didn't expect me to be there most of the time. Our relationship began shifting into what I now call obligation mode. The phone calls during the week were polite but perfunctory. He'd tell me about school assignments or ask about the logistics of the next weekend visit. I'd ask about his grades, his friends, and sometimes his hobbies, but there was a formality creeping in. We were father and son by name, but the easy warmth between us was thinning. It wasn't that James was cold or angry, not yet. He was still respectful, still polite, but there was a subtle withdrawal, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. I didn't know how to stop it, so I kept falling back on the same approach. Work harder, provide more, and hope that in the long run he'd understand. Looking back, I can see how the little moments I missed added up to something larger. Each missed event, each late arrival, each broken promise was a tiny cut. One or two might have healed easily, but over time, they layered into something I couldn't see until it was too late. At that time, I believed I was doing the right thing. I was convinced that building a safety net for James was the best gift I could give him. I thought love could be measured in tuition payments, in savings accounts, in never having to say, "We can't afford it." But the truth was simpler and more painful. James never asked for any of that. He didn't need a father who could buy him everything. He needed a father who showed up. And slowly, without me realizing, he stopped expecting me to. By the time James reached his teenage years, something fundamental in our relationship had shifted. The warmth that had once made our weekends special began to fade, replaced by a formality that felt almost practiced. He was polite, still respectful, but there was a weight in the air between us. When he was 13, I noticed it for the first time in a way I couldn't ignore. I'd call him during the week, the way I always did, but the conversations had become mechanical. "How's school?" "Fine." "Need anything for your classes?" "I think I'm okay." "How's soccer practice?" "It's fine, Dad." That word again. Fine. Always fine. It was the kind of answer that closed doors instead of opening them. I told myself it was just teenage moodiness, that he was growing up and pulling away like kids do. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Our calls started revolving around logistics. I'd ask about school fees, supplies, or if he needed money for trips. He'd answer in short sentences, thank me, and then we'd hang up. I started to realize that I knew very little about what was actually happening in his life. I didn't know his best friends' names anymore. I didn't know which subjects he liked or disliked. I couldn't remember the last time he'd volunteered information about his day without me asking. One weekend, when he was 14, I tried to break through. We were sitting in my living room, a basketball game playing in the background. I asked if he wanted to go to the park and shoot some hoops, something we used to do all the time. I can't, he said. I promised Mom I'd help Grandpa with some stuff. It seemed reasonable at the time. But over the next year, those moments became more frequent. There was always a family commitment on his mom's side. I didn't think much of it until I overheard a comment one Sunday afternoon when I was dropping him off. Karen's father, standing just inside the doorway, said quietly, maybe thinking I couldn't hear, "Your dad only shows up when it doesn't interfere with his job. Don't let him guilt you into thinking he's changed." James didn't respond, but he didn't correct him either. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted beyond my control. I later learned that over the years, bits and pieces of conversation from his mother's side of the family had painted a picture of me that wasn't entirely true. The narrative was simple. I had chosen my career over my family. Every missed game, every recital, every weekend I couldn't make was another piece of evidence. The part they didn't tell him was that I had fought to be there, that I had turned down contracts, shifted deadlines, and taken financial hits in attempts to make time. The sacrifices I made were invisible because they didn't change the outcome. From the outside, it looked like I just didn't show up. As James grew older, he became more self-sufficient. He got a part-time job at a hardware store, started driving, and spent more time with his friends. He no longer needed me to provide for the little things. But with each new milestone of independence, there was also more distance. The weekends became quieter. He'd spend time in his room, headphones on, phone in hand. We still had dinner together, still exchanged polite conversation, but the energy was different. The spark I used to see in his eyes when I arrived on Friday nights was gone. I started to dread the silences. I filled them with more questions about school, about his future, about whether he needed help applying to colleges. But even those conversations felt clinical, like I was a financial advisor more than a father. I remember one Friday evening, I asked if he wanted to see a movie we both used to love watching when he was younger. He hesitated, then said, "Maybe another time, Dad. I'm tired." I knew that tired wasn't the real reason. It was in those moments that I began to understand the full scope of the gap between us. I had worked so hard to secure his future, but somewhere along the way, I'd lost my place in his present. And yet, I held on to the belief that when he was older, when he was an adult, he'd look back and see the bigger picture. That he'd realize I'd been doing my best for him, even if I'd failed in the way that mattered most. What I didn't know then was that the story he'd been told about me wasn't mine to control. And the gap between our truths was growing wider every day. There's a strange thing about guilt. It doesn't make you stop what you're doing. It just makes you work harder at the wrong thing. By the time James was in high school, I had fallen into a pattern that felt almost impossible to break. I knew there was distance between us. I could feel it every time I called and heard the polite, careful tone in his voice. Every time I saw the way he kept a little space between us when we met in person. But instead of addressing it head on, I buried myself in work. Work was the one place where I still felt in control. Deadlines, projects, promotions, they all came with clear rules. If you put in the hours, you saw results. It wasn't messy, it wasn't emotional, and there was no risk of saying the wrong thing. At home, or rather, in my relationship with James, it felt like everything I said had the potential to make things worse. So I kept working. I told myself that if I just got through one more product launch, one more project cycle, one more fiscal quarter, I'd finally take that vacation I'd been promising James for years. I pictured us going to the Grand Canyon, or maybe taking a road trip up the coast. The kind of trip that could make up for all the missed weekends. But every time I thought the timing was right, something at work shifted. A project would get delayed. A client would need more revisions. Or a crisis would hit just before I was supposed to take time off. I'd call James, my voice bright and apologetic, and say, "We'll do it next break, I promise." At first, he'd say, "It's okay, Dad." And maybe he even meant it. But over time, those words became automatic, delivered without much feeling. I started to realize that the trips weren't just postponed. They were disappearing. The plans had become empty rituals, and James knew it. There was a spring break when he was 16 that still haunts me. I had promised him months in advance that we'd go fishing, something he'd always wanted to try. He even mentioned it in passing during one of our calls, and I could hear the hint of excitement in his voice. But a week before the trip, a crisis hit at work. I called him from my office, feeling sick as the phone rang. "James, I'm so sorry. There's been a situation at work. I can't get away next week." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then in a flat voice, he said, "I figured." Those two words, "I figured," cut deeper than anything else he could have said. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was expectation. He had stopped believing I would show up. That was the moment I realized James had built a life where I was optional. He had his friends, his job, his school. His routines no longer revolved around the weekends we spent together. I had become a guest star in a show that no longer needed my character. And still, I didn't change my approach. I convinced myself that things would be different when he graduated high school, that I'd have more time once he was in college. I told myself that he was busy with his own life anyway, that I didn't want to intrude. It was easier to keep my head down, to tell myself the story that he understood. The truth was, I avoided the harder reality. I was afraid that if I tried too hard to close the distance, I'd have to face how far apart we really were. James, for his part, stopped expecting me to be there. He stopped asking for trips, stopped mentioning events, stopped waiting for me to show up. And, in some twisted way, that made it easier for me. No expectations meant no visible disappointment, but what I didn't understand at the time was that every missed opportunity was a brick in the wall between us. By the time I realized how high that wall had grown, it was almost impossible to see over it. Looking back now, I can see how I let my own guilt turn into avoidance. I told myself I was giving him space, when in reality, I was giving myself an excuse. And every time I said, "We'll do it next time," I was quietly teaching him that next time never really came. James turned 25 quietly. At least, it seemed quiet from my perspective. There was no party invitation, no family gathering I was told about. I found out about his birthday from a photo posted online, a picture of him at a small bar surrounded by friends. He looked older than I remembered, older, more self-assured, but also closed off. It hit me harder than I expected. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself there would be a natural turning point, that once James was an adult, free from the constraints of custody schedules and teenage resentment, we'd talk more. We'd reconnect as two grown men, maybe even find some common ground. But as the years passed, the silence only deepened. That silence became unbearable. I decided to try something different. I started with an email. It was simple, just a short note saying happy birthday, that I hoped he was doing well, that I'd like to meet sometime. I read it over and over before hitting send, trying to keep the tone light, but sincere. I didn't want it to feel like pressure. Days passed with no reply, so I wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, a letter on paper, in my handwriting. I figured maybe the physicality of it would mean something. I told him I was proud of him, even from afar. I acknowledged the distance between us and admitted that a lot of it was my fault. I didn't beg, but I did ask, "Would you be willing to have coffee with me?" I mailed it and waited. Another week passed, then two. One evening, as I was going through old boxes in my apartment, I found a shoebox filled with photos from when James was a child. His kindergarten graduation, the trip to the zoo when he was 8, a rare Thanksgiving we'd spent together. Looking at those moments, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. I realized I'd been clinging to memories of a boy who no longer existed. Then, out of the blue, I got a message. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't even a letter. It was a short email from James. Coffee. Saturday, 10 a.m. at Hunter's Café. That's all I can give you. My heart jumped. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. It wasn't warm. It wasn't an olive branch. But it was something. I spent the next few days rehearsing what I would say. I didn't want to waste the opportunity. I planned to start with an apology. Clear, direct, no excuses. Then I'd tell him I wanted to move forward, to rebuild if he was willing. But there was something I didn't know. While I was preparing for a reconciliation, James had a different plan. He wasn't meeting me to reconnect. He was meeting me to close the book entirely. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early. Hunter's Café was a small place downtown, the kind of spot I imagined James might choose for its neutrality. No family memories here, no nostalgia to cloud the air. I chose a table in the corner, ordered a coffee, and waited. Every time the door opened, I glanced up. My chest tightened each time it wasn't him. When James finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was shorter, neatly styled. He wore a dark jacket over a button-down shirt. He looked professional, like a man who had built a life without me. "Hey, Dad," he said flatly as he approached the table. "James," I said, standing up. "It's good to see you." He sat down without much expression. No smile, no hostility, just a controlled neutrality. For a few moments, we exchanged small talk. Work. The weather. I tried to steer the conversation towards something meaningful, but his responses were short. Finally, I leaned in. "James, I want to apologize for everything I missed, for all the times I wasn't there." He looked at me, expression unreadable. "We don't have much to talk about, Dad." The words landed like a punch. I nodded slowly, trying not to show how much they hurt. I know, but I was hoping. Maybe we could try anyway. James glanced at his watch, then back at me. That's not why I'm here? Something shifted in my chest. What do you mean? He exhaled, his jaw tightening. I'm here because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. You've reached out. I agreed to meet. But I'm not looking for whatever you're looking for. I think it's better if we both move on. It felt like the floor dropped out beneath me. All the hope I'd built over the past weeks crumbled in an instant. I tried to respond, but the words caught in my throat. All I could manage was, I understand. But the truth was, I didn't understand. Not really. I didn't understand how we'd gotten here, how 25 years of intentions and sacrifices had led to this cold table in a neutral cafe. James finished his coffee quickly, stood up, and said, "Take care, Dad." Then he walked out, leaving me sitting there with my untouched cup, wondering if that was the last time I'd ever see him. I didn't know it then, but this meeting wasn't the end. It was just another twist in a story I still didn't know the full shape of. In the days leading up to that Saturday at Hunter's Cafe, I was a man possessed. The moment I received James's email, my mind went into overdrive. I drafted what I thought would be the perfect apology, one that was honest but didn't drown in self-pity, one that took responsibility without begging. I rehearsed it over and over, sometimes in the mirror, sometimes in the car during my commute. I even wrote down bullet points to keep myself from rambling. I told myself I had one shot. This wasn't just another conversation. This was a turning point. I dug out old photographs. James at the park when he was 5. James holding a trophy from his middle school science fair. James smiling in a Christmas sweater I'd mailed him when I couldn't be there. I didn't know if I'd show him those photos, but holding them grounded me. They reminded me why this mattered so much. I also thought about all the times I'd imagined this moment. In my head, I saw us sitting across from each other, awkward at first, but eventually warming up. I imagined him asking questions, hard questions, that I'd answer with nothing but the truth. I imagined a long pause, then a slight nod, maybe even a small smile that said, "All right, let's try again." For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel genuine hope. Saturday arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that made the world feel quiet. I got to Hunter's Cafe half an hour early. I chose a table near the window where I could see him coming in. I ordered a coffee I barely touched, my eyes on the door. At 10:05, he walked in. James looked grown. Not just older in years, but in a way that made me realize how much of his life I'd missed. His posture was confident, his expression calm. He wasn't the boy I remembered from weekends and birthday calls. He was a man who had learned to live without me. Still, when I saw him, something in my chest lifted. This was my son, who had agreed, however reluctantly, to see me. "James," I said, standing. He nodded. "Dad." We shook hands. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was something in between, a neutral ground, like the cafe itself. We sat. I asked if he wanted anything to drink. He said no. I tried not to read too much into it. The conversation started slowly. I asked about his work. He told me he was in marketing now. I asked about where he lived. He said he was renting an apartment downtown. The answers were short, functional, but every word he gave me felt like a door slightly ajar. And in those small openings, I saw possibility. I told him I'd been following his career from afar, that I was proud of what he'd accomplished. He gave a small nod, not looking directly at me. There were long pauses. I filled them carefully, trying not to push too hard. I mentioned the fishing trip we'd once planned and never took. He smiled faintly, just enough to make my chest ache. I know I missed a lot, I said finally, leaning forward. And I know an apology can't undo any of it. But I want to say it anyway. I'm sorry, James. For the birthdays I missed, for the games I didn't see, for the times I chose work over being there. I thought I was doing it for you, but I see now I was wrong about what you needed. He didn't respond right away. He stirred his coffee, eyes fixed on the swirling liquid. I held my breath. When he looked up, there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't pure rejection either. I appreciate you saying that, he said at last. His tone was measured, but it wasn't hostile. That small shift, those 6 words, felt monumental. For the rest of the meeting, the conversation stayed careful but steady. We didn't talk about everything. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no emotional hugs, but there were no explosions either. When he stood to leave, I expected the usual parting words, "Take care," or "We'll talk." But instead, he said, "I'll think about what you said." I didn't let my face show it, but inside, that sentence lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a plan, but it was an opening. As I watched him walk out of the cafe, I realized my hope wasn't in the meeting we'd just had. My hope was in the fact that he hadn't closed the door completely. And for a man who had lived with decades of silence, that was enough to keep going. When James agreed to meet again, I thought, naively, that we had turned a corner. Our last meeting at Hunter's Cafe had been stiff, awkward, but there was no finality to it. His parting words, "I'll think about what you said," had played on a loop in my mind. This time, we met at a different spot, a small, quiet cafe closer to his office. I arrived early, as usual, rehearsing my words again. I knew this conversation couldn't just skim the surface. At some point, we'd have to face what lay underneath years of silence. James walked in right on time. He ordered a black coffee, sat down, and looked at me with an expression that was calm but firm. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," he began. His tone was controlled, like someone who had prepared his lines carefully. I nodded. "I'm glad you have. I've been thinking about it too." There was a pause before he leaned forward. His voice was steady, but every word was like a blade. "You chose your career over me." The words hung in the air. I felt them land like a physical blow. I'd imagined this conversation so many times, imagined him saying it, imagined myself responding. But none of my rehearsals prepared me for the weight of hearing it aloud. I swallowed. "James, He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I know you had a job to do," he said, his tone sharper now. "I know you had responsibilities. But every important thing in my life, every game, every graduation, every birthday, you weren't there. You didn't show up, and you can't buy that time back." I drew a slow breath. "You're right. I can't change that. But I want you to know something, James. I wasn't choosing my career instead of you. I thought I was providing for you, that I was doing what a father should. But I see now that I was wrong about what you needed." "I don't think you get it," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't about what you thought. This is about what actually happened. You weren't there." I met his eyes. I know, and I'm sorry. I am truly, deeply sorry for all the times I wasn't there, for all the moments I missed. I can't make them up to you. I can only tell you I regret it more than anything. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to forgiveness, but to something else, hesitation. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, then said, "You know, Mom told me something a while back. I wasn't sure I believed her. She said you fought for more custody, that you even gave up a major contract to try to get more time with me. But she said her parents made it difficult." I blinked. That wasn't something I expected to hear. "She told you that?" I asked carefully. He shrugged. "Yeah, but I don't know if I believe her. I mean, that's not the version of you I grew up with. The version I knew didn't fight to be there." I felt a knot tightening in my chest. For years, I'd kept that fight to myself, thinking it wouldn't help James to know the details. But now, hearing him question it, I realized my silence had left room for doubt. "It's true," I said quietly. "I fought, James, harder than you know. There were things I wanted to tell you when you were younger, but I didn't want to drag you into the ugliness between me and your mother's family. I thought I was protecting you from that." His expression stayed unreadable. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just convenient to say that now." That stung. But I couldn't blame him. Years of absence don't get erased by a single confession. "I can't make you believe me," I said finally. "I can only tell you the truth. And the truth is, I never wanted to be away from you. But the circumstances, they were stacked against me." James looked down at his coffee, then back at me. "I don't know what to do with that, Dad. I don't know what's real." There was a long silence between us. Finally, he stood up. "I have to go." I wanted to say more. I wanted to stop him, to explain everything in detail, to hand him the evidence of what I'd done. But I knew it wouldn't matter right now. His trust wasn't something I could force. As he turned to leave, he paused. "If what Mom said is true, then I don't know who I'm supposed to be angry at anymore." And then he walked out, leaving me alone at the table, staring at the untouched coffee in front of me. When James left the cafe that day, I stayed seated for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I didn't touch it. I wasn't ready to move. My mind kept replaying his words, each one a small fracture in something that was already fragile. I wanted to chase after him, to keep the conversation going, to try and fix something, anything, before it broke completely. But I also knew that pushing him now would only drive him further away. Instead, I reached for my phone. I typed a message slowly, carefully, trying to choose words that wouldn't sound desperate, wouldn't sound like begging. "I'm sorry, James, for everything. I meant what I said. I never wanted the distance between us. I hope one day you'll believe that." I stared at the message for a few seconds before hitting send. Then I sat there, waiting, the phone heavy in my hand. Minutes passed. No reply. Finally, I saw the screen light up, not with a response, but with a notification I wasn't expecting. The little gray check mark next to my message turned into an empty circle. I opened the chat again and felt my stomach drop. James had blocked me. I sat there, phone in hand, trying to make sense of it. Part of me had expected it. He had as much as told me that he wasn't ready, maybe wouldn't ever be ready. But knowing it in theory was different from seeing that single silent act. A block isn't just silence, it's a wall. I went home that evening, feeling the weight of it pressing down on me. The apartment felt emptier than usual. I sat on the couch, the quiet almost deafening, and wondered if I had just witnessed the final moment between us. For the first time, I began to truly consider the possibility that there might be no reconciliation, no second chance, that I had already lived my last shared moment with my son, and it had been at a table in a café, filled with half-finished sentences and decades of misunderstanding. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my desk, and stared at the photographs I'd taken out before our last meeting. James, as a boy, smiling at the zoo. James in his soccer uniform, standing next to me on one of the few weekends we'd had together. I felt a sharp ache looking at those pictures, not just from missing him now, but from realizing how few moments there actually were to look back on. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for weeks, was that James hadn't thrown away everything. He still had the letter I'd written to him before our first cafe meeting. The one I'd sent on paper, in my handwriting. The one where I'd apologized and asked to see him. He'd kept it. Not in a drawer, not in a trash can, but in the inside pocket of his jacket. He hadn't opened it. Whether it was because he didn't want to, or because he wasn't ready, I couldn't say. But the fact that he carried it with him meant something. Maybe not much, maybe nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing to me. I didn't know this then, of course. All I knew was that I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone, and realizing there was no way to reach him anymore. In the days that followed, I found myself falling into a strange rhythm. I'd check my phone out of habit, knowing there would be no new messages. I'd open my email, telling myself I wasn't expecting anything, and then still feel a pang of disappointment when there was nothing from James. I went to work. I came home. I moved through my days like a man half awake. It wasn't just sadness. It was finality. That block on my phone wasn't just a technological barrier. It was a statement. I don't want you in my life. And yet, a part of me refused to fully accept it. I'd told James before that I would always be here if he needed me, and I meant it. Whether he ever wanted to hear from me again or not, that promise stood. But promises are quiet things when they have nowhere to land. I thought about writing him another letter, but the idea of it felt almost absurd. How do you send a message to someone who's already told you, in every way possible, that they don't want to hear from you? And still, in the quiet hours of the night, I imagined him someday unblocking my number, or maybe opening that old letter, or maybe just deciding, out of nowhere, to see me again. It wasn't much, but it was the only hope I had left. After James blocked me, the silence took on a new weight. It wasn't the same kind of silence I'd felt over the years. This one was deliberate, final, or at least it felt that way. Before, there had always been a thread of connection, the hope of a call, the occasional text, the weekends that still happened when he was younger. Now, there was nothing. I started to lose my footing. Work became a blur. I'd sit at my desk staring at lines of code that used to make perfect sense to me, and now I couldn't even focus long enough to write a single function. My colleagues thought I was tired. I told them I was fine, but I wasn't fine. At home, the apartment felt like a cave. Every surface seemed to echo with the weight of memories. The couch where James once sat headphones on, avoiding conversation. The table where I'd once set 2 plates on the weekends, we still had dinners together. The framed photo of him in his soccer uniform, smiling like the world was still simple. For years, I'd carried my guilt quietly, like a low background hum. But now, with James's final rejection, that hum became a roar. It drowned out everything else. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out an old leather notebook from the back of my closet. It had been a gift from a colleague years ago. I'd never used it, until now. I started writing. Not to James, not at first, just to myself. I wrote about the last meeting at the café, about the way his voice sounded when he said too late. I wrote about the years we'd lost, about the birthdays I'd missed, about the fishing trip that never happened. Then, slowly, the writing shifted. I began to write directly to him, as if the notebook itself could somehow carry the words across the silence he'd built. James, there are things I've never told you, not because I didn't want to, but because I thought they'd only make things worse. But maybe you deserve to know them now. Maybe you always did. That's when the memories from the divorce began to surface. Not just the pain, but the details. The parts I'd buried because they were too raw, too complicated. During the separation, I had been offered the biggest project of my career. A contract worth over $1 million. A promotion that would have secured me as a partner in the firm. It was everything I'd been working toward for years. And I turned it down. Not because I didn't want it, but because taking it would have meant months overseas, and I knew the custody battle was going to be brutal. I thought, naively, that staying close, being physically present during the proceedings, would show the court how committed I was to being in James's life. I gave up the contract. I stayed. I fought, and I lost anyway. Karen's parents had influence I underestimated. Their lawyers painted me as a man too consumed by his work to be a stable presence. It was ironic. I had walked away from the biggest deal of my life to prove the opposite, but none of it mattered in the end. The decision was made. Primary custody to Karen. Alternate weekends for me. I never told James this. I didn't want him to think badly of his mother or her family. I thought I was protecting him from the bitterness, from the ugliness of that fight. But sitting alone in my apartment, with no way to reach him, I began to wonder if my silence had cost me more than the court ever could. I wrote it all down. Every detail I could remember. The meetings with the lawyers. The night I called the client to tell them I wouldn't be able to take the contract. The email I never sent to my boss explaining why. It wasn't just about defending myself. It was about recording the truth so that if James ever wanted to know, it would be there. Page after page filled with the story I'd never told him. And as I wrote, I felt something shift. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. Not because I believed James would read these words tomorrow, or next week, or even next year, but because the truth existed somewhere outside my head now. It wasn't locked away anymore. The act of writing became a routine. Every night, I'd sit at the desk, open the notebook, and write a few more pages. Sometimes I wrote about the divorce. Sometimes I wrote about the weekends we'd had, the good moments I hoped he still remembered. Sometimes I just wrote about what I wished I could say to him if we were sitting across a table again. I didn't know if the notebook would ever reach him, but in a strange way, it didn't matter. It was keeping me grounded. It was reminding me that my love for him was still real, still worth holding on to, even if he never accepted it. And somewhere deep down, a fragile thought began to form. Maybe the story wasn't over yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the call came. I was at my desk, half focused on an endless string of bug reports, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. But something made me answer. "Hello. Is this Michael Harris?" A young woman's voice asked. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name's Claire. I'm James's girlfriend." I sat up straighter, my hand tightening around the phone. It had been months since James had blocked me. Months of silence so complete that I'd started to believe I might never hear anything connected to him again. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He's fine," she interrupted quickly. "Mostly fine. He was in a car accident last night, just a fender bender, but he hurt his shoulder, and they kept him at the hospital overnight for observation." The air in my chest shifted, relief and fear mixing in equal measure. "Is he still there?" "Yes, but—" She hesitated. "I know you can't call him. I know about the block." The words landed with an odd weight. I shouldn't have been surprised. Of course, James had told her something about me. But her tone wasn't judgmental. It was cautious, almost careful. "I wasn't sure if I should call," she continued, "but there's something you should know. I found a letter in his jacket from you." I froze. "He still has it?" "Yes. It's unopened." I felt something stir in my chest. Hope, confusion, maybe both. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because—" She took a breath. "I don't think he understands everything. I read part of it, just the first lines. I know I shouldn't have, but it didn't sound like the version of you he talks about. It sounded like someone who's been trying." Her words tightened something in my throat. "Claire, I'm not calling to interfere," she said quickly. "I just thought maybe you should know he's at St. Vincent's Hospital, room 314. I can't promise he'll want to see you, but maybe you should come anyway." When she hung up, I sat there for a long moment, phone still in my hand, the world around me muffled. James had been in an accident. He was okay, but he was in the hospital. And somewhere in his jacket pocket, he still carried my letter. Unopened, but not thrown away. That meant something. I didn't know what it meant exactly, whether it was anger, curiosity, or some strange in-between, but it was enough to make me move. The drive to St. Vincent's felt longer than it should have. My thoughts kept circling the same images. James lying in a hospital bed, James seeing me walk into his room, James turning away. By the time I arrived, my hands were tense on the steering wheel. I parked, walked through the sterile lobby, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Outside room 314, I stopped. Through the small window, I could see him. He was sitting up, his arm in a sling, scrolling on his phone. He didn't look seriously injured, but he looked tired. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand hovering near the door handle. Part of me wanted to walk in, to close the distance, to say something, anything. Another part of me knew that this wasn't my moment to force. Claire's voice echoed in my head. "I can't promise he'll want to see you, but maybe you should come anyway." I didn't walk in, not yet. Instead, I stepped back, leaning against the wall across the hallway. I told myself I was just giving him space. I pulled out a small notepad I carried for work, tore out a sheet of paper, and began to write. James, Claire told me you were here. I'm glad you're okay. I won't bother you, but I wanted you to know I came. I'll be nearby if you need anything. Always. Dad. I folded the note, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote his name on the front. Claire appeared a few minutes later, carrying a bag of takeout. She looked surprised to see me. You came, she said quietly. I nodded, holding out the envelope. Would you give this to him? You don't have to say I was here if you think it'll upset him. She looked at the envelope, then back at me. I'll give it to him. And, for what it's worth, I think he's more conflicted than he lets on. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just said, thank you. As I left the hospital, there was no certainty in my steps. I didn't know if James would read the note, if he'd throw it away unopened, or if it would sit next to my old letter in his jacket. But there was one thing I did know. He still carried my words with him, even if he hadn't looked at them yet. And as long as he carried them, there was still a chance, no matter how small, that one day he'd be ready to open them. The next morning, I found myself back at St. Vincent's. I didn't plan it. I told myself I was just driving by, that I had errands in the area, but that was a lie I didn't bother to fully believe. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about James being here, about the envelope I'd left with Claire, about the unopened letter he still carried in his jacket. I parked in the same spot, walked the same sterile hallway, and found myself once again outside room 314. This time, the door was open. James was sitting on the bed, wearing a hospital gown, with his sling resting awkwardly over one shoulder. His hair was slightly messy, his expression neutral as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up when he heard footsteps. His eyes landed on me. For a moment, I braced myself for the worst, for his face to harden, for him to tell me to leave. But he didn't. His gaze lingered on me for a few seconds, then shifted back to his phone. No invitation, no rejection. I stepped closer, my voice careful. Hey, James. He didn't look up. Dad. That single word felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was neutral. I stayed by the doorway. I heard you were doing better. I just wanted to see for myself. He set the phone down, finally meeting my eyes. Claire told me you came yesterday. I nodded. Yeah, I didn't want to intrude. I just wanted you to know I was here. He didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, thick but not hostile. I took a step inside the room, moving slowly, as if testing invisible boundaries. I won't stay long, I said. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, he said, his tone flat. But there was no edge to it. I nodded, glancing around for a chair. He didn't object when I pulled one over and sat near the bed. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I could hear the rhythmic beeping of the monitor, the faint hum of voices in the hallway. I know this isn't easy, I said finally, me being here. James shrugged with his good shoulder. It's fine. The word again. Fine. It was the same word he'd used so many times growing up, but now it felt different. Not dismissive, just safe. I didn't push for more. There was nothing I could say in that moment that would change years of absence. And maybe, for once, silence was the right choice. We sat there quietly for a while. I could feel the unspoken things between us, the history neither of us was ready to unpack. Then, as I shifted slightly in my chair, I noticed something. On the small table beside his bed was an envelope, my handwriting on the front. It was the letter I'd left with Claire. It wasn't torn. It wasn't crumpled. It wasn't even smudged. It looked like it had been handled carefully, moved, maybe even picked up, but it was still sealed. My chest tightened. James caught my glance. His eyes flicked briefly to the envelope, then back to me. He didn't explain. He didn't say whether he'd read it or not. He didn't have to. The fact that it was there at all said enough. After a while, a nurse came in to check his vitals. I stood, stepping back toward the door. "I should let you rest," I said. James didn't stop me. But he didn't tell me to leave either. As I reached the doorway, I hesitated. "I'll be around if you need anything." He gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. I walked out of the room with a strange heaviness in my chest. It wasn't the same crushing weight I'd felt after he blocked me. This was different. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't forgiveness. But it also wasn't rejection. He hadn't told me to leave. He hadn't thrown the letter away. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something other than despair. I felt the faintest thread of possibility. The next morning, I stopped by the hospital again. I told myself it was just to drop something off, that I wasn't going to linger or push for another conversation. I had learned, finally, that showing up didn't always mean speaking. It meant being present, even in silence. When I arrived, the door to room 314 was half open. James was awake, sitting up in bed, scrolling on his phone with his good hand. The envelope from yesterday was still on the small table beside him, untouched but carefully placed. I knocked softly on the doorframe. He looked up, his expression neutral. "Morning," I said quietly. "Morning," he replied, voice steady. I didn't walk all the way in this time. I stayed by the door, holding a folded piece of paper in my hand. It wasn't another long letter. It was just a short note, the kind that could fit in a pocket without taking up space. "I didn't want to bother you," I said. "I just wanted to leave you this before I go." He didn't ask what it was. He didn't move to take it from me either. So I stepped closer, set it gently on the table next to the envelope, and stepped back. The note was simple. "I'll be here whenever you need." That was all. No pleas for forgiveness, no promises I couldn't guarantee. Just the truth of what I felt. I stood there for a moment, not expecting a response. "I'm heading out," I said softly. "Take care of yourself, James." He didn't answer. I turned and started toward the door. And then, just as I reached the hallway, I felt it, the weight of his eyes. I glanced back, and he was watching me. Not glaring, not cold, just watching. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no sudden reconciliation, no cinematic hug, no tears. Just a steady gaze, like he was seeing me in a way he hadn't in a long time. I gave him a small nod, then stepped out into the hallway. Walking away from that room, I felt an unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't closure. It was something quieter. For years, every meeting with James had been a fight against a locked door. I'd been pushing, knocking, begging for it to open. Now, for the first time, I felt like maybe the door wasn't locked anymore. It wasn't open wide, but there was a crack. And sometimes, a crack is enough for light to get in. I didn't see James again that week. Claire texted me once, just a short message letting me know he'd been discharged and was resting at home. She didn't say whether he'd read the letter or the note. She didn't have to. Somehow, I felt okay not knowing. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my relationship with James in immediate responses or grand gestures. I was measuring it in the fact that I was still here, and he hadn't closed the door completely. In the weeks that followed, life moved forward. Work returned to its usual chaos. My apartment remained quiet, but it no longer felt like a cave. It felt like a place I could wait in. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the envelope and the note. I'd imagine James picking them up, maybe on a quiet evening when he was alone. I'd imagine him opening one, maybe both. I didn't imagine what he'd feel. I didn't pretend to know. But I imagined him seeing my handwriting, reading my words, and understanding, maybe for the first time, that I had always wanted to be there. Weeks turned into a month. Then one evening, I came home to find a small package in my mailbox. There was no return address, just my name written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single photograph. It was one of the old ones, from the zoo, when James was 8. In the picture, he's standing next to me, grinning in a baseball cap. Behind the photo was a sticky note with 2 words written in block letters. I remember. There was no signature. I didn't need one. That night, I sat at my desk with a photograph propped up against my notebook. I didn't take it as forgiveness. I didn't take it as an invitation. I took it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, the door was still open a crack. And for now, that was enough.